This is Land of Havilah, Psalm 3. It's 8 verses. We'll read the whole thing and comment. Verse 1. A psalm by David when he fled from Absalom his son. Yahweh, how my adversaries have increased. Many are those who rise up against me. Many there are who say of my soul, there is no help for him in God. Selah. But you, Yahweh, are a shield around me, my glory, and the one who lifts up my head. I cried to Yahweh with my voice, and he answers me out of his holy hill. Selah. I laid myself down and slept. I awakened, for Yahweh sustains me. I will not be afraid of tens of thousands of people who have set themselves against me on every side. Arise, Yahweh, save me, my God, for you have struck all of my enemies on the cheekbone. You have broken the teeth of the wicked. Salvation belongs to Yahweh. Your blessing be on your people. Selah. Comment: the word Selah appears 3 times in this psalm. It appears in many other psalms as well at the end of some of the verses. It's a Hebrew word of uncertain meaning. Perhaps it indicates a break in the music, or it means that we should reflect on what was just said. In verse 1, David wrote this psalm when he fled from his son Absalom. The situation was that David was king of Israel, and his son Absalom staged a coup. By the time David discovered it, it was already highly organized and taking over the kingdom. Therefore, David and his loyal followers had no choice but to immediately evacuate Jerusalem and head for the wilderness, 2 Samuel 15. David figured correctly that if Absalom's men caught him, they would kill him. It was all God's retribution on David because he committed adultery with Bathsheba, and to cover it up, he murdered her husband, 2 Samuel 12. As a result, God told David that he would raise up evil against him out of his own house. Absalom's coup was the fulfillment of that word. But in all this disastrous turn of events, David didn't curse God, as we see in this psalm. Far from it. In verse 1, Yahweh, how my adversaries have increased. Many are those who rise up against me. End quote. For 4 years, Absalom had been campaigning behind the scenes to win the hearts of the Israelites, and he was successful. Suddenly, David found out his kingdom was against him. David didn't know he had any adversaries, and suddenly the number of them was overwhelming. Thus, the exclamation in verse 1, how my adversaries have increased. In verse 2, many of David's adversaries figured there's no help for him in God, end quote. They were looking at the circumstances and figured God had abandoned him, wouldn't help him, and there was no way David would recover. And it was true God was against him in that moment, but David had faith and the prophetic insight to know that God would relent, that God's mercy and loving kindness was on him forever. In verse 3, even when the disaster was unfolding, David said, You, Yahweh, are a shield around me, my glory, and the one who lifts up my head. In verse 5, when David was on the run, he knew the smart thing for Absalom would be to attack him right away, while he had women and children with him, and before he could put them somewhere safe and organize a defense. So when David woke up that first morning and was still safe, he knew from God that he would be okay. Thus he said, I laid myself down and slept. I awakened, for Yahweh sustains me. So we should note his great optimism. He didn't have blind optimism or optimism with no basis. He knew as a matter of fact and faith and prophetic knowledge that God would protect him. He knew from the nature of God he would be okay because it wouldn't be in God's nature to abandon him. So we can always be confident and optimistic in God even on our worst days. In verse 6, almost all David's kingdom is against him, but he'll not be afraid of tens of thousands who have set themselves against him on every side. In verse 7, a prayer that God would complete what he started and keep protecting him, quote, Arise, Yahweh, save me, my God, end quote. He remembered the past, how God smashed all his enemies in the face in previous times, and he has faith God will do it again. Quote, For you have struck all of my enemies on the cheekbone, you have broken the teeth of the wicked. End quote. But David had been wicked himself. How did he know God was still with him, that he wouldn't be the one to have his teeth knocked in because of his grievous sin? Because of what he said in Psalm 32:2. Blessed is the man to whom Yahweh doesn't impute iniquity, end quote. He figured by faith Yahweh didn't impute iniquity to him. In the final verse, salvation belongs to Yahweh. He knows God's in charge and will save him. Psalm 4 is next.